right, we are recording. We still have one person that needs to take the exam, so I can't say too much about the exam yet. I was hoping the grades would be higher, but we can, I think probably I'll let you guys retake the exam. Just on my hand, depends on how this last person does. What else? Lab, I'm sure you guys saw the announcement. For the rest of the semester, essentially we're done coming in for lab. So next week's lab is online, because all you're gonna do is watch a video and answer some questions. The week after that is vacation, so we have a week off for Thanksgiving. And then the week after that is the last week of regular school, regular class before finals. And like I said on the announcement, you don't have a lab to do. All you need to do, what I'm gonna do is take your lowest lab score, and that's gonna be your last lab score. So I'll send you an email sometime between now and then and tell you which lab it is. And you can either just keep the score, or you can just go back and fix that lab and get full credit for the lab, potentially. So any questions about that? All right. Well, it's 8 o'clock. We'll slowly get started here while I'm pulling this up. Also, another reminder, again, so we've got this coming up week, then we have a week off, then we have another week, and then it's finals. So you're running out of time. So if you feel like you're not doing well and you're worried about passing this course, I mean, it's a little bit late to be worried about that, but better to start worrying about it now than next week. All right. So any questions? Sounds good. Let's jump into chapter 19. Chapter 19 is all about population ecology. So once again, we're no longer dealing with organisms. We're no longer looking at cells. We're looking at the bigger picture. Let's do the guessing game. Obviously, you can tell what this is a picture of. It's a picture of people fishing. Any idea what your book might be getting at with this picture of people fishing? Any guesses? And I'm reading on the screen from myself exactly what your book said. No guesses? Well, this is talking about over harvesting. So we have an issue in this world where people are overfishing and over harvesting other things. And at the end of this chapter, you can understand why that's such a big deal. Also, on that note, you understand why people have to get fishing licenses and things like that. How about this picture on the right? Obviously, that's a picture of a landfill. So you can see all the trash being dumped, and then the machinery there working at the landfill. Any idea what your book is getting at with that? No guesses? You guys seem as tired as I am. Well, I'm reading too. Your book says, where is it at? In the United States, there are 40 pounds per week of trash produced for the average U.S. citizen, at least at the time when this book was published. So that's a good independent work topic if you want to look into it. What is the current number? Is it still 40 pounds per person? How about this picture? It's a picture of a lot of people in line. Any guesses as to what your book's getting at with that? Nope. Okay. Your book says that one person per second, or if you were to count one person per second, it would take more than 22 years to count all the humans on Earth. So if you were to go around counting everybody on Earth, one person per second, that's how long it would take. And again, this is back when the book was published, so that's something else you could look into and do the math. What is it now? If you were to count every single human being on Earth right now, how long would it take? And of course, we have bush elephants right here. Are there any guesses as to what your book is getting at with that? All right. So your book says that given unlimited resources, one pair of elephants would be 19 million in 750 years. And obviously we don't have that many elephants, right? So this goes to show you that there are limited resources. And things can't just, populations of organisms just can't explode. And by the end of the chapter, you'll understand why. Like what limits populations from doing that. So any questions about that? All right. The beginning of every chapter starts with this, biology and society. As always, I'm going to skip it. This one's about an invasive species. It's called the lionfish. You can look into it for independent work if you want, or anything else for that matter. To me, it's an interesting topic when you talk about invasive species. For example, cats are invasive species. So we can look into that, write about that for independent work if you want. All right, so this chapter is broken down into 4 main bullet points. The first one is an overview of population ecology. Then after we talk about the overview, we're going to get into population growth models, and then applications of population ecology, and then finally, human population growth. This is probably one of the most relevant chapters that we've done so far. Now, granted, when you think about it, cellular respiration was obviously relevant because without cellular respiration, you would be dead. But you don't control your cells, and you don't see your cells. This chapter is about important things that you control and things that you are a part of. So here we go, an overview of population ecology. First thing you need to understand is what a population is. I defined it in the last chapter, and your book defines it in this chapter too. It's slightly different because it depends on the context. But in this chapter, we are saying a population is a group of individuals of a single species that occupy the same area at the same time. Now, the fact that they occupy the same area at the same time is important because that means they are relying on the same resources, i.e. competing for the same resources. They're influenced by the same environmental factors. So if there's a flood, or a hurricane, or a volcano eruption, or an earthquake, or a nuclear bomb, whatever happens to one is going to happen to the whole population, right? And then also they're likely to interact and breed with one another. Make sure you know what a population is for the example. First word for attendance, I'm going to circle it. There it is. That's the first word for attendance if you're online. And obviously, as always, make sure you send the words in before 9 a.m. All right. So that's what a population is. Any questions about what a population is? All right. So if we know what population is, then what is population ecology? Population ecology is concerned with the changes in the population size and the factors that regulate populations over time. So really, when we're talking about population ecology, we're talking about looking at a particular population and understanding basically what it thrives on, right? What makes it live, what kills it, what makes the population grow, what makes the population shrink. And there's no need to write down this second bullet point because we're going to talk about each of these individually. But if we're talking about a population, we describe it in a number of different ways. The first thing we talk about is size. I'm sure you're really familiar with that. Right? So you might say, West Virginia has 1.8 million people, or however many we have right now. Or the world has 7.8 billion people, right? That's the size. Age structure. So, you would talk about how I think West Virginia has a lot more older people per capita, for example, and fewer younger people. Or if you were to look at the campus of WVSU, I would assume on the campus we have a lot of young adults and fewer kids and fewer older adults. We can also look at the density. So instead of just saying, oh yeah, there's 1.8 million people in West Virginia, you might say, there's on average, 7 people per square mile, whatever it may be. But you're talking about like how many there are per square mile. And we'll get into details on all these. But if you download this PowerPoint and click that bullet point right there, there's a 12-minute video you can watch about population ecology. So any questions so far? All right. Here's some pictures for you from your textbook. Here we have a biologist that's attaching a radio collar to a black bear, because if you're studying population ecology and you want to know, why the bear population might grow or decrease, then you need to study the bears. Same thing here. We've got a puffin. So this researcher's obviously measuring the beak of that puffin. And then, of course, we have a researcher right there who's marking some meerkats. All right. Next thing you need to understand is what population dynamics are. And those are the interactions between the biotic and abiotic factors that cause variations in population size. So if population ecology is studying the things that make a population grow and shrink, then really you could say population ecology studies population dynamics, right? Because those are how a population interacts with itself. It interacts with the living things in its environment, which is the biotic, and how it interacts with the non-living things, which is the abiotic. So think about deer, for example, in West Virginia, right? So if there's plenty of food, then you're going to have more deer, generally speaking, right? Because that's how the deer population interacts between the biotic environment. More food, more deer. Of course, if you get too many deer, they're going to get killed because they get in the road too much and they get hit by cars. And that would be an abiotic factor, right? Because cars aren't living, but they certainly affect the population of deer. And an important aspect of population dynamics is what we call population growth. I'm sure you guys already know what population growth is, but basically it's the number, right? And it's dictated by births minus deaths, and that tells you what the population growth is. Anyway, any questions so far? This stuff is pretty straightforward. I don't know, you might write this down. I don't know if I'm gonna test you on it or not yet. But population ecology plays a key role in a lot of applied research, which goes to show, this isn't just an academic discussion we're having. This is actually important to your everyday life. You might not think about it because you might not think this pertains directly to you, but it does in the big picture. So some of the things that we're talking about are, population ecology provides information for conservation and restoration projects. So for example, can you tell what this is a picture of? You don't want to hear this, people online, but I can't hear them. Can you tell what that's a picture of? So that's mountaintop removal, right? That's coal mining. That's a picture in West Virginia where they're trying to get some coal, and you can see they just basically destroyed the entire top of the mountain. However, there are rules and regulations. It's not like they can just blow off a mountain and be done with it. They have to come restore things. And there's rules for that because population ecology provides the information and provides those rules. It's not like you can just say, all right, you cleared that mountain, just go put a bunch of grass seed down there, right? It doesn't work that way because the researchers who are familiar with that ecosystem say, all right, you're going to first need to plant this, and you need to plant this. You're going to make sure this, grades this way, and you have a stream right here. So yeah, that's just one example. On a similar related note, population ecology is also used to develop fisheries. That's also a big thing here in West Virginia because they release trout, for example. And somebody is in charge of saying, all right, if you're going to catch fish, you can only catch this many per day, and they have to be this big, and they have to be this sex, right? They're coming up with these numbers for a reason because there's people studying population ecology, and they know, well, at least in theory, we think we know the sweet spot, right? Because if you overfish, then you're going to destroy the whole population, and you're not going to have any fish to begin with. Population ecology is also used to manage wildlife populations. So really, these two bullet points are almost the same. It's just the top one seems to be very specific. If we're talking about managing wildlife populations, we could be talking about this, for example, elk, right? And again, West Virginia is an example. There used to be elk living here in the wild, but then we killed them off. And recently we've started importing them again. So anyway, again, wildlife populations, elk, deer, fish, stuff like that. Someone has to say, all right, we can only kill this many, and they have to be this big, and all those rules that someone comes up with. And then finally, population ecology plays a role in providing insight into controlling how pests and pathogens spread. So, any questions about this slide? All right, so the next word for attendance will be this thing right here. It's an elk. That is the second word for attendance. Any questions? All right, like I said, there's different ways that we can talk about the population. Density, age structure, all that stuff. First thing we're going to talk about is population density. And again, at first it seems pretty simple. Because even if you're not a biologist, when you think of population, you're probably thinking human population. And I'm pretty sure you've probably heard of things like how many people per square mile, right? So we're familiar with that. But there's other things too. And your book gives some examples. For example, a largemouth bass per cubic kilometer, right? So when you talk about humans, you often talk about per square mile, for example. But if you're talking about something in water, you're not talking about square miles anymore. You're talking about cubic miles, or in this case, cubic kilometers, because we use metric in science. Another example is oak trees per square kilometer, right? So you could go to Canal State Forest and put a number to that. How many oak trees are there per square kilometer? And then again, another example, nematodes, which are tiny little worms. How many nematodes per cubic meter in a forest soil? All those things, and of course the classic one, humans per square mile. If you download this PowerPoint, click that, you can watch a short video about human population. Any questions about this? Basically, this whole slide is saying, listen, I know you're used to humans per square mile, because this is what we talk about all the time. You have to think too, it's not just square miles, we're also talking about sometimes cubic, right? So we're talking about soil, water or something like that we were talking about. Cubic meters. So how do we measure this? Again, for humans, this seems simple. For humans, we have a census, right? People go out, letters go out, people fill it out. We actually know how many humans, for the most part, are in the United States. We know, for the most part, how many humans are on Earth. Because it's easy, right? We keep track. When a human is born and a human dies, generally speaking, we know about it. But we're not just talking about humans, so it gets a little bit trickier when we're talking about nature. In most cases, it is impractical or impossible to count all individuals in a population. So for example, and I don't know this for sure, but I would assume if you were to Google it, you could probably find how many oak trees, since we just talked about it, how many oak trees there are per square mile in Canal State Forest. And it's not because someone went out and counted every single oak tree in the Canal State Forest. There's just techniques, right? So they would go out and count a certain amount of oak trees per, I don't know, like maybe in a radius of 100 meters. And they would do it randomly somewhere else for a radius of 100 meters. And they do it somewhere else. And once they've done that enough times and have enough numbers, then statistically they could say, okay, Canal State Forest has X amount of oak trees per square mile. Anyway, so your book also gives some examples of other ways of doing it. So number of bird nests, if you're counting a particular, maybe how many bald eagles are in the state of West Virginia. It's not, and I bet you could look that answer up too. These are all things you could look up for independent work. Yeah, so how many bald eagles are there in the state of West Virginia? I bet if you Google it, there's an answer. And I almost guarantee you that the people who have that answer did not count every single individual eagle, but they know how many eagles live in a nest. They know what their territory is, so having the number of bird nests probably helps them with that estimation. Rodent burrows. So the next picture I'm going to show you is a picture of a bunch of groundhogs. You can't physically go count every single groundhog, but you know how many on average live in each hole. So from that, you can deduce the number of rodents in that case. Then termite mounds, et cetera, et cetera. The point here is, again, you're talking about population ecology and you're talking about population and counting the numbers of individuals in a population. You're not always going out and counting each and every one of them. There's different techniques for that because sometimes, again, that's impractical or impossible. And here's the picture I was talking about. There's a few groundhogs. It's hard to see, but there's a hole in that area, a hole in this area, a hole in this area. And again, if you're somebody who studies groundhogs would know that, well, on average, a hole this size would hold this many groundhogs. So they don't need to count each one because that would be a little bit hard. Them always popping up and down. But they can count the holes and estimate from there. So any questions? All right, population age structure. This is pretty simple stuff too. You need to know what a population age structure is, and that is the age structure of a population is the distribution of individuals in different age groups. So a loose example of that would be saying, again, West Virginia has more older people per capita than most states, right? And that was true years ago. I don't know if that still is true. But, specifically, you wouldn't do it so generally, but specifically, if you were studying, I don't know, the population of cardinals in Kanawha Valley, right? You would describe, that's one of the ways you would describe it. Not only you would say, all right, there's about 50,000 cardinals in the Kanawha Valley, you could also say, in most of them, the highest number of them are 5 years old, and the least amount is, 10 years old. And there's none of them that are older than 15 years old, right? That's how you would describe a population via the age structure, which is important. It's not just looking at the age structures, because that, sure, that helps a little bit, but there's importance behind that. Because it provides insight into the history of a population's survival. So the next slide I'm going to show you, gives an example of this. So for right now, just leave it at that. Same with this. It provides insight into reproductive success. And it provides insight into how the population relates to environmental factors. No need to write all that down. Here's an example. So let's say you're studying this bird, right? You just got to whatever desert this bird is in. You're doing your study. You haven't been doing this study for years. Like I said, you just got here. So you can't get in a time machine and go look back, 11 years, right? You can't do it. But what you can do is look at the population, look at the age structure, and you can document this. So you can see here, there's very few 1-year-olds. There's no 2 or 3-year-olds. There's a lot of 4-year-olds. There's no 10-year-olds. right? So you look at the population, you just started this study, and just from these numbers, you can start assuming things, right? So obviously, something very bad happened 2, 3, and 10 years ago, right? And if you're just now starting to study this population of birds, you can use that, right? You don't need a time machine. You can just say, all right, 2, 3, and 10 years ago were very bad for this population. And then maybe you can just start looking things up, right? That's the observation. So the question is, why? What's making these things die 2, 3, and 10 years ago? And then you start looking things up, right? What were the climate? What was the climate 2, 3, and 10 years ago, right? Was it extra dry that year? Was it extra wet that year? Extra hot, extra cold? Whatever it is, you can look those things up and make some assumptions, basically, that you could then test as hypotheses. So any questions about that? I'll put a big X to this, because obviously that is just an example. I'm not going to ask you any questions about these birds. If anything, I might give you this graph and ask you questions about it and say something like, what year was the best year? How long ago was the best years for these birds? And you can just look and say, oh yeah, 4 years ago, something good must have happened. So again, probably you will not see that graph again, but if you do, you'll just need to interpret it. So if there's no questions, let's move forward to talk about life tables and survivorship curves. First, things get slightly more complicated, but not too much. First of all, life tables, you need to know what they are. Life tables track the survivorship, which is the chances of an individual in a given population surviving to various ages. So again, if you already have the age structure of a population, right, that's the first thing you're figuring out. Then, as years go on and you continue to study the age structure, then you can figure out the chances of an individual in a given population surviving to various ages. For example, I assume you're in your 20s, is that correct? Mm-hmm. Right? So the chances of you getting to your 30s, very, very high, right? The chances of me, I'm in my 40s, the chances of me getting to my 50s, pretty high. Not as high as your chances of getting to the 30s. But, the chances of somebody in their 80s making it to the 90s, very low, right? So that's what we mean by the chances of individuals reaching a certain age. And knowing this helps us determine the most vulnerable stages of the life cycle. So for us, when we're talking about humans, we already know that, right? We know, generally speaking, older people are more fragile, right? We know that. But keep in mind, even though these are humans we're looking at here, keep in mind, we're not just talking about humans, we're talking about all kinds of other populations. So again, think about DNR, the Department of Natural Resources in West Virginia. They come up with these rules for fishing and hunting. Like, all right, you can catch only this many. You have to do it in these months. And they have to be this big and this sex, right? They have rules. Part of being able to come up with those rules is understanding this. Not for humans, but for other populations. Like at what age are they most vulnerable? So if they're most vulnerable from ages 5 to 6, if we're talking about trouts, and I'm just making that number up, I don't know, then you would say, all right, well, don't catch them when they're this length, because that means they're probably in that vulnerable stage. Anyway, that being said, here's an example of a life table for humans. You can see, again, that they're looking at 100,000 people. They studied them over a generation or a lifetime. So, you started off with 100,000, and then of that 100,000, 833 died, so that's the percentage, right? So 99.2% of the people made it to age 10. And then of those people, 363 people died. So 99.6 of that population made it to the next decade. And then 99% made it to the next decade, 98.7, so on and so forth. So these are numbers you're probably familiar with. So again, your chances of getting to the next decade are extremely high until you hit around 60s and 70s, right? That's when it starts going drastically lower. And then obviously it gets really low the older you get. So I'm gonna put a big X to this because again, this is nothing to memorize. This is just an example. I'm not gonna give you a test question. Like, what are the chances of a 40-year-old making it to the age 50? You said you don't need to memorize. Oh, that's 0.987. Nothing to memorize. But again, maybe I would show you this and yes, ask you that question. Just to see if you could interpret the table, but it's all right there. So any questions about this? All right, the next word for attendance would be age. Circling it right there. Age is the next word for attendance. All right, so if that's what a life table is, this is interesting because a lot of times in labs, you'll see there's like, we look at data, we have a table of it, and and then I ask you to graph it, right? So same situation here. There's the table, the next thing is a graph. And what we call that is a survivorship curve, and you need to know that for the exam. Survivorship curves plot the individuals that are still alive at each age in the maximum lifespan. So it's really just graphing, well, yeah, the population, right? So all that information we just saw on the table, it's a graph of that, right? It's how many people are alive at that age. Let me back it up. I'm not going to show you the curve yet. I'm going to go back to the table. Just try to picture in your brain what this graph would look like, right? If we're talking about percentages, we would have a lot, right? The graph would be like this, right? It'd be slowly sloping from 99%. Actually, it would go up a little bit right there from 99.2 to 99.6, right? So 99%, still a little bit lower, 99%, 98%, 97%, 94%, right? So it's slowly sloping. And then you get here 87, 72, 40, and then it starts dropping, right? Try to picture that in your brain. That's what it would look like, for humans anyway, for that table. And this is what it looks like. Again, for humans, right? So your chances of surviving to the next decade are very, 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 very high until you get old. And then all of a sudden your chances start dropping. Meanwhile, there's other organisms, and your book is using an oyster as an example, where your chances of surviving being born basically are very low, right? That's why you have this kind of curve. That's a type 3 survivorship curve. So think, for example, dandelions, right? You guys seen those things where you blow on and they're floating in the wind? Those little things are seeds. And a seed is a living individual. It's a living organism. And most likely, most of those seeds aren't going to make it. Hence, this right here, right? So the chances of a dandelion making it past being a seed is very slim. But for those that do make it, life is pretty steady afterwards. That's type 3. Type 2, right here in the middle, it's where everything is pretty equal. So for, again, squirrels are the example that your book gives right there. There is no certain period in a squirrel's life where it is at most vulnerable, right? Its chances of dying are pretty steady through its whole lifespan. For the exam, you need to know the difference between type 1, type 2, and type 3. I'm hoping the way you can remember this is we're humans, so we base everything off of us for the most part. So if you can remember that humans are type 1, and just remember that, humans usually live to be a pretty old age, and that's when our chances of surviving start dropping. If you can remember that's type 1, and just remember the opposite of that is type 3, and therefore type 2 splits the difference. So any questions about this? Okay, again, you need to know the difference between type 1, type 2, type 3, and for the exam. Most likely, I'm not going to ask you what the survivorship curve is. Most likely, I'm going to describe some sort of organism, some sort of population, and then you're going to tell me, is it type 1, is it type 2, or is it type 3, based on that description. And here's everything I said, but in writing. Type 1 survivorship produces few offspring. So humans have relatively few offspring. Again, using the dandelions as an example. When you blow that thing, all those little things that are floating around, each single one of those is a seed. That is an offspring. And when you think about how small a dandelion is and how many offspring it has compared to humans, right? We don't have that many offspring. We provide few offspring. We give them good care. And because of that, there's an increasing likelihood that the young will survive to maturity. Because we care for our young, unlike a dandelion or an oak tree, right? So all those little acorns, each one of those is an offspring. And most of them won't make it. So the opposite of type 1 is type 3, where you have low survivorship at first. So again, dandelion seeds, acorns, so on and so forth. But once you get past that low survivorship at first, that is followed by a period where the survivorship is high for those few individuals who actually made it, right? That's type 3, the opposite of type 1. And then, of course, the one that splits the middle is type 2. That is when survivorship is constant over the lifespan. So any questions about type 1, type 2, or type 3? And no, you don't need to see the next slide. I need to fix that. Because the next slide is just going back to the chapter overview, which takes us to life history traits as adaptations. Basically what I'm saying is everything I just told you about type 1, type 2, type 3, all these things, this isn't random, right? This all happened because of evolution. We've evolved to be type 1, or we've evolved to be type 3, depending on what kind of organism we're talking about. Which brings us to the life history. And you need to know what life history is. It is the set of traits that set the schedule of reproduction and survival. So we're very familiar with it for humans, right? Again, we know generally people start getting old around 70, 80, right? So at that point, that's when your chances of surviving to the next decade get really low. We know that with the survival portion of humans. We also know that humans generally can reproduce, at least physically, at puberty, right? So in your teens, so we culturally don't do that, luckily, but that's when we know humans can reproduce. Anyway, and those are just humans. So if you're studying any population, then you need to know the life history. When do they reproduce? Like elephants, for example. How old are they when they can first reproduce? How long is their gestation period? How many elephants do they have per pregnancy? How long do they survive? Like, all the things you would need to know if you want to know the life history of an elephant, for example. So the population's pattern of survivorship is an important feature of its life history. We'll talk about that as we move forward. The key life history traits include this, and these are things we've kind of already talked about. But again, age at first reproduction. So again, for humans, it's puberty is when we're first physically able to reproduce. Again, frequency of reproduction, like how often do humans typically have kids? Of course, humans again are a weird example because we have cultural things at play with humans, but maybe look at dogs, right? How often can a dog get pregnant and have puppies? And when they do, when she does have puppies, what's the average number, right? And what's the amount of parental care given? Obviously, for most mammals, it's a pretty good high parental care because they give them milk and things like that. Actually, this is a good idea for independent work. Think of your favorite creature or plant, whatever, and look these things up, right? Look up the life history traits of something that you like. Like, are you into dolphins? Are you into turtles? Are you into palm trees? Whatever it is, these are things you can look up. Anyway, any questions about this slide? All right. As you already know from chapter 13, also it's a good time to remind you, I should have done this at the beginning. Obviously, we went from chapter 13 to chapter 19. We skipped a lot of things in between. You can read them if you want, but you don't need to. Anyway, again, reproductive success is the key to evolutionary success, right? I mentioned this, I think on Friday when we talked about survival of the fittest, right? And I said how that term is not exactly accurate because when we're talking about evolution, it's not just the ability to survive, because if you can't reproduce, it doesn't matter because you're not passing along your genes. So reproductive success, that's the key, right? Yes, you need to survive to reproduce. Again, without reproducing, survival doesn't matter as far as evolution is concerned. So it's the combination of life history traits that represent a trade-off or balances where you balance the demands of reproduction and survival. So for example, again, humans, elephants, things like that, we have fewer offspring, but we put more resources and time into them. So there's a high chance of our fewer offspring surviving. Meanwhile, something like a dandelion, it has thousands of offspring because each one of those little tiny things right here, there's a picture of it, each one of those tiny little things is a seed. That is an offspring. And it gives it no care. I know this sounds weird, but when you think of a plant, essentially, the bigger the seed, the more parental care there is. Because again, each seed is a baby, if you want to think about it like that. It's an offspring, right? It's a fully grown, well, not fully grown. It is an offspring. It's its own individual being. So yeah, the bigger the seed, the more parental care is given. So think about that versus a coconut, right? Coconut's like that big. It's all liquidy, it's fleshy, right? There's a lot of stuff. Anyway, are there any questions? Let me back up to where we were. We were talking about this, the idea of reproductive success and how there's trade-offs, right? Do you have a lot of offspring and don't put any resources into them, just hope some of them make it? Or do you have fewer offspring and put a lot of resources into helping them make it, right? Or somewhere in between. That's what we're talking about there. So are there any questions about that? All right, back to where we just words. You need to know this term for the exam as well. Opportunistic life history. So if we're talking about life histories, like I was saying, you should look those things up for independent work if you want, for the things you're interested in. We have ways of labeling them, right? There's different types of life histories. And the first one we're talking about is this one here, the opportunistic life history. And you need to know what it is. So most likely for the exam, I'll give you an example. You have to say, oh yeah, that's an opportunistic life history. So in the example I give, this organism, whatever it is, this hypothetical organism I'm talking about, will take immediate advantage of favorable conditions. So again, dandelions are a great example. One day they're not there, next day they're all over your lawn, and then a few weeks later, for the most part, they're all gone, right? Something was good in the weather, in the climate, and they just sprouted up and said, all right, now it's time for me to get rid of my seeds. And they do, and then they're done, right? It took immediate advantage of those favorable conditions. But more importantly, at least for the exam, more importantly, an opportunistic life history typically exhibits a type 3 survivorship. For the exam, you should equate these things. Opportunistic life history and a type 3 survivorship. And remember, type 3 survivorship is where they're like, all right, we're going to produce as many offspring as we can. We're not going to pay attention. We're not going to help the offspring. We're just going to produce a bunch of them and hope some of them make it. So any questions about that? All right. So let's talk about the opposite of that. So again, for the exam, you need to know opportunistic life history, and you also need to know the opposite, which is equilibrial life history. So it's just the opposite. So obviously we know that opportunistic life history is the type 3 survivorship. Then we should know, and it's not, here it is. Then we should know that the opposite of that would be the type 1 survivorship, which is us. Anything that has a equilibrial life history reaches sexual maturity slowly. So again, think about so many plants that they only live 1 year, right? They grow, they make seeds, they die, right? All within a year. Unlike us, we reach sexual maturity very slowly, relatively slowly. We also produce relatively few and well cared for offspring, which humans can sometimes be the exception. It's the foster care system and things like that. But generally speaking, right, we take care of our offspring. It's not like people just like having babies and just like leaving them out in the wild and hope they make it. Also, equilibrial life history organisms that follow it are typically larger bodied and longer lived. So again, humans are relatively large, like compared to a plant or a rat or something like that. And we generally live longer. And the next slide I'm going to show you compares the traits. So we just talked about opportunistic life history, and right now we're talking about equilibrial life history. And the next slide is going to give you a slide where you can compare and contrast. And these are just some examples of things that have equilibrial life history. So again, dandelion would be opportunistic, right? All those tiny little seeds that have basically no protection, right? That's opportunistic. Then you have a palm tree. That's a good example of an equilibrial plant. Those coconuts, each one of those is a seed. So there's a lot more resources put into those seeds. Anyway, any questions about this slide? Here's the table I was telling you about. This is a great thing for studying, to be able to compare and contrast. So, what kind of climate do they live in? For opportunistic, it's relatively unpredictable. For equilibrial, it's relatively predictable. How long does it take to mature? How long is the lifespan? How high is the death rate? Right? All these things. So again, for the exam, most likely I will give you an example. I'll just describe some population, and you just need to recognize it by the way I describe it, if it's opportunistic or equilibrium. So when you're studying, remember, there's not going to be a question where I say, list off all the characteristics for an opportunistic population. Right? It's not like you need to memorize each one of those things. You just need to recognize it if I give it to you in the exam. So, any questions? Awesome. So we finished the first main bullet point. Let's jump into the second main bullet point, which is population growth models. We've already kind of talked a little bit about population growth. We've hinted at it, but let's dive a little bit deeper into it. You need to know what causes the population to fluctuate, and you probably already do know But here it is in writing, right? So population size fluctuates as new individuals are born or move in, or when they die or move out. It's pretty simple, right? You already know this. So what makes a population grow or shrink? Well, birth and death is one thing, and then there's immigration with an I, and then immigration with an E, right? So people, things coming in and things coming out. And we have models in ecology that investigate how the size of a population may change over time under different conditions. And again, for humans, that's a different story. Humans were kind of like on our own, but if you were, again, I don't know, studying a population of bears, grizzly bears in Alaska, right? You might want to know how the population has been changing over time under different conditions. So let's talk about it. The first model we're going to talk about, before I jump into it, again, for the example, I'm going to give you an example, and you need to understand, when I give you the example, I'm going to say, was that an example of exponential growth or logistic growth? So as I'm teaching these, keep that in the back of your mind. That's how the exam will go. You need to understand the difference between the two, and then be able to recognize it when I give you an example. Exponential growth. This is an expansion in an ideal and unlimited environment. Which is pretty, I guess, academic, you could say. It's more on paper. It's not very often that there is an ideal and unlimited environment. Kind of comes close with bacteria, right? So if you had some rotten meat in your refrigerator, some bacteria floated onto it from the air, some tiny little bacterium, that would be an ideal and unlimited environment. And you'd have some nasty little infection on that piece of rotten meat, right? Anyway, in exponential population growth, the population size of each new generation is calculated by multiplying the current population by a constant factor that represents the birth rate minus the death rate. For example, and I don't even know this, so let me see. Let's look this up. I'm just curious now, because it changes all the time. What is population growth rate of humans? So 1.08, of course, this is a lot. I don't have time to look into it. Here we go. Let's just say this, 0.84%. Now that sounds kind of small, but considering there's 7.8 billion people on Earth, or 7.9, oh, I'm sorry. Look at that. Might as well be 8 billion, right? So let's see. 8 billion. I wish you guys could see this. I would put it up on the screen, but 8, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 2, 3. That's 800 million. Let's multiply that by 0.84. So we would have an additional, no, I can't do right. I did my math wrong. Anyway, that's the point, right? That's what a growth rate is, right? You take the population, you multiply it by the growth rate, and that's what your new population is going to be. And this is why the human population growth rate looks like that, right? That's our chart. Technically, we're still in an exponential growth model. Even though we're not in an unlimited environment, which is what I told you, right, as part of an exponential growth, but technically because humans kind of change their environment and make their environment perfectly suited for humans, then we're still in an exponential growth rate. Anyway, any questions about that? All right. Oh yeah. So if you were to graph it, and I just did show you kind of a graph of the human population, so that was a good example. If you were to graph the population and you see a J-shaped curve, that would be a great example of exponential growth. And that will be a test question. So make sure you understand that. So you need to know the difference. And I'll go ahead and tell you what the other one. The other one is an S-shaped curve. We'll talk about that when we get there. But if there's a question that says, which of the two growth models has a J-shaped curve? The answer is exponential. Because think about it, right? J just kind of goes straight up, right? It doesn't go down at all, it just goes straight up because it's an exponential growth, right? There's nothing slowing that down, so it goes straight up. The steeper the slope, the more it's growing, right? So the slope shows how rapidly the population is growing. So for example, we had a population A. This might be a test question, something like this. And there's the graph. If the slope is like this for population A, and then I said population B, and the slope was like this, I might say, which of those populations is growing faster? And the answer, well, any guesses? Which of those populations is growing faster, A or B? B is correct, right? Because you can tell by the slope. The steeper it is, the faster it's growing. Your book also points out that exponential population growth is common in certain situations. For example, following a disturbance. What is a disturbance? It's basically something that kind of temporarily changes the status quo of the ecosystem. So a fire, a flood, a hurricane, a drought, cold snap, tornado, earthquake, nuclear bomb, right? Something that changes things temporarily. And that's when, again, you would commonly see exponential growth. Basically, in a sense, it's not going to be like this on the test. This isn't 100% accurate. But in a way, when you're getting exponential growth is when things are starting over, right? So that's what this is, right? If you have a disturbance, after a fire, you're kind of starting over. After a flood, you're kind of starting over. After a hurricane, you're kind of starting over. So you should associate this, generally speaking, with a new population. Anyway, any questions about that? All right, the next word for attendance is these two little creatures right there, which are rabbits. Rabbits. Anyway, that's just an example. So this shows the population growth, right? You can see that J-shaped curve. It's J because it's going straight up, right? It's not coming back down, it's going straight up. That's exponential growth. Obviously, again, this is just an example. When you're studying, you don't need to memorize this. I'm not going to say, what population size of the rabbits, or what was the population size of the rabbits at 7 months? You don't need to memorize that. But if I were to give you this on an exam and ask you to interpret it, you would say, okay, 7 months, so right around 125. Anyway, any questions about that? Excuse me. All right, so that's the end of exponential growth. The opposite of that, the other one, would be logistic growth. Because, as you can imagine, most environments are not unlimited. Actually, no environments are unlimited. If you think about it, right? Everything is finite. Even if you're bacteria, eventually, you're gonna theoretically you would reach the limits of your resources. And what do we call that? What are the things that are keeping you from your limit? And those are called limiting factors. Limiting factors are environmental factors that restrict population growth. So for deer, right? And I don't know, I'm not an expert on deer, but I'm assuming one of the environmental factors for deer are vehicles, right? Because they get hit by cars. Probably disease, probably access to food and water. So again, the limiting factor is basically something that dictates population growth, right? So any questions about that? All right, next important term you need to know is something called carrying capacity, which is the maximum size a particular environment can sustain. The maximum population size, specifically. Maximum population size. So if you were to look at the population of darn near anything in West Virginia, right? What's the population of, oak trees? What's the population of squirrels? What's the population of coyotes? Whatever. It's probably a pretty constant number because it's probably hit its carrying capacity, meaning it's already maxed out. If you have any more, they'll probably die off from a lack of resources. Which brings us finally to what logistic growth is. And logistic growth is when the growth rate decreases because the population size is reaching the carrying capacity. So it's like the J-shaped curve, that we just talked about, except it gets to that point where it's like, all right, this is the limit. So it starts leveling off, in which case you get the S-shaped curve. So again, if we're looking at these seals, if you were doing this study in 1930, right? So imagine this doesn't exist. You would say, all right, well, no, it still has that kind of curve that way. If you're doing this study in 1925, so ignore that, you would say, oh yeah, these fur seals are in an exponential growth pattern, right? And they were back in 1925. But then they got to their carrying capacity, the things started evening out. So wherever it is, that particular environment can only hold about, 9,000, right? A little bit more than 9,000, almost 10,000 individuals. And you can see that's the red line, right? It kind of shows the average. But when you look at the actual data, it's not perfectly fit on that red line. It just kind of goes around. So sometimes the population gets a little bit higher than the carrying capacity, then it crashes back down, then it eases back up. But that's how that works. So again, for the exam, make sure you're familiar with, I'm going to back up, make sure you're familiar with what carrying capacity is and understand what logistic growth is. And that is a good place to end it. So I guess the last word for attendance is going to be these little guys here, right? These seals. All right, well, I gave you extra credit for wearing red. We're going to invite take our picture. Oh, before I get off too, I'll remind everybody, my office hours are going to be online today because I have to go out of town. So if you need me, don't come to my office, visit me online. Chris, no one ever does come to my office. This will be the first time someone wants to. I came to see you, but you weren't there.